Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Part 3. Serious People of Reddit. What is your downright scariest real-life story? I was home alone. Must have been about 12? I had come home from school. Dad was at work. Mom was with a friend, and I was sat watching TV. We had a side gate which connected the street, through a little alley which we shared with the neighbors, into our backyard, which would usually have been unlocked as my dad tended to cycle to work, but he had taken the car that day, so the door remained bolted and pushed in place with this rock. We always used to stop it from rattling when it got windy. So I'm watching cartoons when I hear that side gate bang open against the wall as if it had been pushed with an immense force. I want to check it out naturally. Saw the side gate swinging. The rock was halfway up the garden. The bolt was undone. I checked the alleyway, not a person in sight. The other gate at the very end of the alley was shut as it normally was. I quickly locked the side gate, locked the back door and grabbed a knife, before running upstairs. Stupid to bring the knife, I know, but I was 12. I hid there in fear that someone or something was trying to get at our house, and eventually I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up at around 5 a.m. and the end of my bed was on fire, like fully ablaze. I had a bunk bed. The flames were licking the ceiling. One of the most terrifying moments of my life. I still cannot explain it to this day, but to have two super terrifying things happen on the same day? I was with my wife and kids by New Smyrna Beach, Florida, and felt pretty comfortable in the water because I grew up near there and this is my home beach as a kid. I went out around 7 a.m. to take some pictures of waves by myself. If you know this beach, a sandbar develops about 60 yards offshore that you have to swim out to, only about shoulder-high water, and then you get to the sandbar which you are about waist-high. I am out there taking pictures by myself, and about 8 feet behind me is a big black object in the water. It was so big. I thought it was a manatee at first. I then realized it is a bull shark checking me out. Nobody out there. No surfboard. Just me and a tiny camera. I faced the shark as that is what you were supposed to do, and then it turned away. I then had to make the decision to swim back via sprint or slow and calm. I yelled to the beach, panic yell, for my wife to watch me, and she had no idea what was going on. I did the quietest, fastest freestyle swim 60 yards. Scariest minutes of my life. I don't have a crazy fear of sharks, but I was really scared of a big bull's dark and murky water. About 8 years ago, I was taking my sister's boyfriend home after we had all gone out to see a movie. It was really late, around 1 a.m. on a dark country road. I was starting to get really sleepy and feeling drowsy when I saw a black, hooded figure waking across the road I was on, but saw him too late and was going to run it over, and almost like it was made of smoke it disappeared. I was like, man, I'm starting to hallucinate because I'm sleepy. Then my sister's boyfriend was like, whoa, what that was. I instantly felt the hair in the back of my neck stand up. He saw the exact same thing. I stared to really regret taking him home because then I had to go back through the same area by myself. After I left him, I hauled fast through the old country road. I don't know what that was, but now I hate driving those roads late at night. Got in line at takeout restaurant to order. The man in line ahead of me casually turned to look at me, did a blatant double take, and immediately got out of line and stood by the door. I kept an eye on him as I ordered, got my food, and left. He followed me out right on my heels and across the parking lot. As I walked to my car, I tried calling family members on my cell. By the time my mom picked up, everyone was at work and couldn't answer immediately. I'd made it to my car. I turned around and the guy was just a few cars away, facing me and doing a bad job acting casual, just standing in a parking lot with my hands in my pockets staring at the sky. I calmly but loudly told my mother that I was fine, but there was a man following me across, location, parking lot, and he's wearing. Dude bolts away from me, gets in his car a couple rows over, and peels out. Idiot. I'm just glad he was so awful at subtlety. Many years ago, I was out Christmas shopping and got into a car accident. Basically, I was in a turn lane, slowing down to go left when a car pulled out in front of me. I caught the driver's side of their vehicle in the door area with the front of mine. After shaking off the shock, I made sure the people in the other vehicle were okay. They called the police and an accident report was written up. Neither vehicle was able to be driven from the scene. The men in suits in the other car were picked up by more men in suits in a black van. I was left waiting with the police officer, who told me the accident was my fault, but I wouldn't be given a ticket because there was no proof. I was really angry, especially considering the officer didn't even take my version of the events. She only spoke with the men in the other car. She then told me the men in the other car were government agents. I mouthed off a little. I couldn't help it. I was pissed. I asked if the reason I was blamed was because they were who we were and I was a kid. She sternly told me that wasn't the case, then left me freezing in a parking lot alone while I waited for my ride. My ride took me right to the body shop where both vehicles had been taken, so I could get my belongings out of my vehicle. While I was there, I took a bunch of photos of both vehicles. When I called my insurance company after I got home, I mentioned the circumstances and was told, "We're not going to be intimidated." I felt better, like I had someone in my corner. When I mentioned having taken photos, he requested them, and I happily obliged. Fast forward a week or so, haven't heard anything from anyone. I call my agent and am told that my photos prove I was at fault. I couldn't believe it. He went on to explain that due to the way the vehicles looked, the other car was stopped, and I just sped right into the side of it. I was angry as hell at the suggestion that I had been speeding along like an idiot and T-boned someone, and was now convinced the other party had influenced my agent into this conclusion. Ultimately, there was nothing I could do. I had to just go along with it, but that was where the scary part began. Government agents showed up at my home, wanting to question me about the accident. I politely declined. One day at work, the same two men from the accident randomly showed up at my place of work. It was too much of a coincidence to believe they were there to shop. It really started to shake me and made me paranoid that I was being watched. My employer even asked me if I'd had run-ins with the bureau one day. When I asked why, I was told someone had called and had been asking questions about me. Almost a year after the fact, I got a call from my insurance agent, asking me more questions. I had come awfully close to dropping them after how I had been treated, but ultimately decided not to. Anyway, I asked what this was all about, and he told me the bureau had come poking around again, in connection with a possible case of whiplash. He asked me if I wanted to make a statement. I declined. The whole experience left a really sour taste in my mouth, and had me looking over my shoulder for quite a while. Prior to this, I'd never had a bad experience with the man, and believed that if you did nothing wrong, you had nothing to be afraid of. Not after this. Even if you were innocent, the truth could easily be manipulated to fit someone else's agenda. I guess it put the fear of Big Brother in me. One day while I and my little sister were playing in our backyard, I was trying to teach my little sister, 7 at the time, how to do a front flip. She was crazy about gymnastics at her age. I tell her that she needed to get up in the air before she tried to flip. Well, she did, but ended up landing on her head. My mom saw what happened and was going outside to check up on her. Well, then she got to the trampoline, walked about 10 feet before outright falling flat on the ground. I look over at her and started to panic. I flipped her over and she wasn't moving. All I heard was an exhale and then nothing. I start freaking out thinking she just died right in my eyes. But my mom was quick enough to rush over to us and take her inside. She ended up waking up and started to move again as we went inside. I was very relieved. She had a bloody nose though. The next day we started to wonder what actually happened and why she passed out. My mom thought that as she fell and hit the ground, she must have hit her head. Fast forward about 5 years, and I still have no clue what happened. And yes, my sister is doing just fine, thank God. One day while I and my little sister were playing in our backyard, I was trying to teach my little sister, 7 at the time, how to do a front flip. She was crazy about gym in modern times. Half the men in America have worse stories about Iraq and Afghanistan. But my scariest one was working a suicide vest post-blast in Taimyr, Iraq, in 2008. Taimyr was renowned as the sideshow of central Iraq at that time, basically a no-man's land that we only nominally had control over. We had a FOB, forward operating base, in Taimyr, but our presence in town consisted of getting through the streets in and out of town as quickly as possible while running missions. IEDs everywhere, sniper fire at the FOB guard towers on a weekly basis, the Hearts and Minds campaign abandoned. So, something that frequently happens with a suicide vest is that the head of the person wearing the vest detaches from the spinal column and shoots up into the air. This is actually beneficial from an intel perspective because the face often remains largely intact, so the suicide bomber can be identified, and being able to identify a suicide bomber is significant for obvious reasons. So, we found the spine with most of the upper torso, larger chunks of other body parts, but nothing we can really use to ID the bomber. We're on one of the main streets in Tarmiya with 2 to 3 story buildings lining the street, fist-sized chunks of flesh scattered all over the street for about 100 yards in both directions, a smoldering Mercedes off to the side, the target of the suicide bomber, destroyed bodies in the Mercedes, a woman wailing over the bodies of her 3 children laying in body bags in her front yard, dirt. It's just a scene out of a horror movie. A significant risk with IEDs is secondary IEDs. IEDs rigged deliberately so that once American forces arrive at a post-blast scene, they get booby-trapped by a secondary IED. So, while we have to watch every step to make sure we're not stepping on chunks of human flesh, we also have to watch out for secondary IEDs, and we have to keep a directed presence, weapons pointed at, the second and third story windows of the surrounding buildings to try to ward off sniper fire. And we have to find the human head. We can't leave until we locate the head. And now the sun is setting. So, we hypothesize that the head may have been blown off the body at an angle, over the buildings, and into a palm grove, cultivated date trees, behind the buildings. We organize a search party for the palm grove, resembling the search parties for missing people. We're going to walk 5 feet apart out and back for the entire length of the palm grove, about 100 yards, using our nods, standard issue night vision goggles, to look for the head. The insurgency love to hide their weapons caches in palm groves because they're such a pain in the ass to search, and they're almost always within walking distance of their homes. So, a lot of palm groves were booby-trapped. Plus, now that it's dark, the sniper risk has increased exponentially. And, in our area of operation, they had recently begun using this new technique. I can't remember what it was called, where they would rig an IED to a small parachute, loft the IED at American forces, and be 100 yards down the road before the IED impacted. We actually once had one land in the caminetting on top of our vehicle while we were in it, that thankfully failed to detonate. Different story though. Being in a palm grove right behind a 3-story building, someone could simply throw a parachute-rigged IED out a window and be gone before it landed. So, there was that risk as well. Anyway, to make very long story shorter, as we made the trek down and back through the palm grove in the dark, in 100-degree heat, looking for the human head, thinking that there was a 5% chance that every step we took could be our last, my fear wasn't dying. It was, I don't want to die here. Like this, in this miserable, dark place. I don't want the last emotion I feel to be, I'm in a living hell on earth. In both body and mind, it was probably the darkest place I've ever been. A couple of hours later, around midnight, a helicopter located the head on a rooftop. Asks at her age. I tell her that she needed to get up in the air before she tried to flip. Well, she did, but ended up landing on her head. My mom saw what happened and was going outside to check up on her. Well, then she got to the trampoline, walked about 10 feet before outright falling flat on the ground. I look over at her and started to panic. I flipped her over and she wasn't moving. All I heard was an exhale and then nothing. I start freaking out thinking she just died right in my eyes. But my mom was quick enough to rush over to us and take her inside. She ended up waking up and started to move again as we went inside. I was very relieved. She had a bloody nose though. The next day we started to wonder what actually happened and why she passed out. My mom thought that as she fell and hit the ground, she must have hit her head. Fast forward about 5 years, and I still have no clue what happened. And yes, my sister is doing just fine, thank God. I worked in a hospital in semi-rural Southern Africa back in apartheid days. Problems in the lab meant I needed to go into work around midnight. Approaching Main Road into the township, where the hospital located, there was a roadblock. About a dozen soldiers flagging down cars, all armed with automatic rifles, and very obviously staggeringly drunk. They were obviously not expecting to see a white face, but for some reason I must have seemed like a threat, and as I wound down the window to talk, 2 rifle barrels were thrust into the car pointing at my face. The leader was almost incoherently drunk, and I could hardly understand his lurid words and shouting. I tried to stay calm, be polite, not provoke, etc. I had my hospital ID badge on the dashboard, managed to persuade him he needed to pick it up and look at it. I had my hands up and wasn't going to twitch unless told to. It was all very tense until one of his colleagues came over, possibly a little more sober, looked at the ID and started shouting, "Doctor, doctor." And it all sort of de-escalated and I was allowed on my way. I'm not a doctor. The ID badge incorrectly put the title before my name and I was waiting for the corrected badge to arrive. But I feel that mistake may have saved me that night. A business rival hired 50 cops to strong-arm my mom and stepdad. At one point, they held my folks hostage in their own office building. Another time, my mom woke me up to tell me that the cops were coming for us and that she sent my stepdad away with my sisters. Armed with only a sledgehammer, a screwdriver, and a pickaxe, I was ready to defend my mom against them. I put on clothes I was okay dying in and we waited. Fortunately, they couldn't enter our home due to a legality as no one answered the door so they could hand over a document that basically acknowledges that they could enter. Some kind of warrant. This and innumerable other incidents throughout my youth have given me a violent prejudice against businessmen, police, and politicians. Many of her rivals were active in local politics. For context, I'm from the Philippines, one of the most corruption-ridden countries in Asia, and where the local police force is described as the biggest gang in the country. I was part of the volunteer search and rescue unit as a rescue diver. My job involved looking for missing persons in the sea or river. My first recovery was my scariest one. If you don't know what happens to human bodies after prolonged marine exposure, trust me, don't look it up. In this case, the 30-ish-year-old woman has been missing for 3 days. At this point, we were just looking for evidence she might have been in a cove/underwater cave system, mostly looking for personal items. My diving buddy and I were looking at a rock formation when we found a watch. We sent a marker float. I was busy writing down the location and time while my buddy bagged the watch when I felt something brush my shoulder. I turned around to see a white cut and partially eaten and decomposed hand touch my shoulder. I quickly recoiled and watched in horror as the body bobbed in and out of a dark crevice under a rock formation. I'm not going to go into details as to how she looked like to spare you. Turns out she decided to end her life. She was a suspected sex trafficking victim and had slit her wrists before jumping in the sea. It happened when I was 4. There was this old man who always brought a small rope with him and a teenager boy who looked huge and physically strong. They often knocked on doors asking for money. Then one time, they knocked on the door and I opened it. They didn't even let me open the door fully. They pushed the door so hard that I fell to the ground. My guess is that they thought I was alone. They tried to grab me, but luckily my parents were home and they came out. They got a little defensive and still didn't want to leave the house without getting any money. My father gave them some money to these crazy people. Thankfully, they left. After a week, we hear on the news that a kid my age was strangled to death in our neighborhood by an old man and the house was robbed after. From that day on, I never opened the door from strangers again until I became an adult. I was about 20 years old and still lived with my parents and younger siblings. I was watching TV and my sister, 16, came in and ripped the remote from me and turned it to something else. She has 5 inches on me and a god complex, so rather than try to fight for it back and get my ass beat in the process, and then getting in trouble for being mean to my baby sister, when my parents got home, since she's always been the favorite and has never faced any punishment for anything until she started getting arrested later on, I let her change the channel and we watched what she wanted to watch. About 10 minutes before that show ended, she got up and walked out of the room and shut herself in her bedroom. The show ended. A new episode started. Then that ended. She never came back. So after 45 minutes of watching this bullshit show and playing on my phone, or else I would have changed it sooner, I changed the channel back to what I was watching. 15 or 20 minutes later, my sister came back and told me to change it back. I said no, and her show had ended anyway. She told me again to change it back, but in this guttural scream. Her eyes were dark, and she looked like she was trying to will me to burst into flames. I said no again, and that she had left for an hour, and her show was over. She stormed away, furniture and picture frames shaking from her, literally stomping like a child. She went into the kitchen and got a steak knife, and as she entered the living room, she said she was going to make me pay. She chased me in circles around the coffee table until I made a mad dash for my bedroom and locked the door as I slammed it and threw myself in front of it. We lived in a really rural area, so I didn't have enough service to call 911, and I couldn't grab a landline before shutting myself away. My sister shook the doorknob and ordered me to open the door so she could kill me. I stayed in front of the door. She could have easily unlocked the door since the locks were those child-safe locking doorknobs that you only needed a coin or something small to unlock from the outside. So my own body was my last line of defense. But I guess she was too angry and eventually walked away. Obviously, I didn't leave my room until my parents got back. I told them, but they brushed me off. I turned that interaction over and over in my head for weeks. How could I have done things differently? There was no de-escalating with her. If she was going to rage, she was going to rage. That much hasn't changed since she's become an adult. But anyway, a few weeks/months, I can't quite remember, later, the same thing happened again. She took the remote, changed the channel, left the room before her show ended, didn't come back until well after I changed the channel back, and tried again to chase me with the same steak knife. But this time, instead of a dash to my room, I took off to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest cleaver out of the knife block. The one that was always super sharp because nobody used it, but my dad would still sharpen periodically. She tore after me, but stopped when I turned around with a blade 3 times the size of hers. With the same fire in her eyes, she demanded I put it down. I said no. She repeated herself, and I shouted, "Come make me, bitch," while brandishing the cleaver. After staring into each other's eyes for a minute, she turned around and walked out of the kitchen and back to her room. She was strangely cool and calm. I don't remember if she put the knife on the table as she walked past or not, but I kept the cleaver on me as I kept watching TV. I don't remember if my parents commented on the cleaver when they came back or if I put it away when I heard them come into the driveway, but she never attacked me with a knife again. Key words being with a knife. It wasn't just because of this incident, but how my sister was slashes in general, but I was diagnosed with CPTSD from my dealings with her. Some of my family is still trying to tell me that we need to stop acting like children, and I need to put in the effort to have a good relationship with her, but they've never been threatened and attacked with a steak knife over changing the channel of the TV. That with a rake. Luckily for me, and not so luckily for them, some of my family has seen her true colors and are on my side. About a month ago, I was staying in a room in the bottom floor of a hotel on a work trip in Ukiah, California. At about 3 in the morning, I'm woken out of a dead sleep to someone pounding on my hotel window screaming bloody murder, very obviously trying to break through. Because my brain wasn't quite awake yet for some reason, I thought they were gunshots and immediately hit the deck. Once I realized what was happening, I grabbed my firearm, I carry for work, and just stood there in my underwear in absolute terror waiting for whatever was about to come through that window. What made it worse was the sounds this person was making didn't sound human. The screams and moans almost sound animalistic, and there were no distinguishable words being said. The screams turned into crying, then back to angry, all while continuing to pound on my window as hard as they could. I didn't want to turn on the lights as I didn't want them knowing someone was in that room, and enticed them even more to come in. I phoned the front desk to let them know what was happening, and the sweet old lady told me she would take care of it, which I could only assume meant calling the police. Eventually, the person gave up and moved on. I assumed because either security or law enforcement took care of it. After about 20 minutes, I went out to ask her the result, and she stated, "Well, by the time I went out there to chase them off, I didn't see anyone. The homeless like to congregate at the Walmart across the street. So yeah, the rooms closest to there tend to get pretty noisy." I was like, "Damn it, Mabel, if I had known you were going to go out there alone, I would have just handled it myself. You're absolutely insane." It's one thing when I'm in work mode and in uniform, I have no problem dealing with that, but when I'm caught off guard at my most vulnerable, it's a completely different feeling. Needless to say, I don't stay on the first floor of hotels anymore. This sounds incredibly stupid compared to other people, but I spent a night thinking my mom had died. She'd gone on her first date with my now stepdad, and I was living about 200 miles away at the time, so I just asked her to text me when she got home. She didn't. Her WhatsApp was showing her as last being active at the time she'd last texted me. The message I'd sent after that hadn't been seen. She hadn't replied to her friends who had also checked in. I was convinced stepdad had murdered her or something, and I'd end up on a podcast talking about it. She replied the next morning after waking up to so many texts and missed calls from me and some of her friends. It turned out her landline was down, which turned off her wife. So she'd sent WhatsApp messages when she got home, but they hadn't sent. She assumed they had, so she'd left her phone downstairs and gone to bed and hadn't realized people had been calling her frantically all night. I tried to ground her, but apparently it doesn't work that way around.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.